Good evening, my friends. 9 o'clock on the dot. I was looking at my hair today, and I think, I don't know, am I going to be able to make it another month? I'm not too sure, but it's getting long on top. Maybe, maybe I need to go to the store and get like some dye just for men or something like blonde or platinum. Put some platinum in my hair. Go funky, right? Nobody's going to see me anyway. Well, you guys see me every night. So I don't know. Maybe that's not a good idea. But I trimmed the beard today because it was getting a little bit unruly. And yeah, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see when those barbers and hairstylists and all those folks get to reopen. But I'm gonna be ready for a cut. I think in about a week. But I don't think anybody's going to be able to give me a cut. I think it's going to be about a month. And my older son, he needs a cut. So whether he likes it or not, he may have to get a dad cut. Anyway, we're doing great. We got into chapter 12. We did over a chapter last night. Well on our way through. Oh my goodness, let me get that yawn out of the way now. Well over a third of the way through the book. And we're still looking for some sunshine, but not there yet, but we'll get there. We'll get some sunshine in our book, and we'll have some sunshine in our lives too. I have no doubt. And we got some good news tonight that we're going to talk about. So, but let's do some reading. So one of the consequences of this episode was that, oh, that's right, Jurgis twisted a tendon right in his ankle, tried to go back to work, almost made it a day, but then almost fainted again. And now the doctor, is the doctor saying, if you don't wait 2 months to go back to work, you're probably going to be lame, right? You're going to have lamed your leg, your ankle, and you're going to be permanently hurt. So, here we go. One of the consequences of this episode was that the first joints of 3 of the little boy's fingers were permanently disabled. Well, that's right. Little Stanislaus had gotten some frostbite pretty bad. And another that thereafter he always had to be beaten before he set out to work. Whenever there was fresh snow on the ground, Jurgis was called upon to do the beating, and as it hurt his foot, he did it with a vengeance. But it did not tend to add to the sweetness of his temper. They say that the best dog will turn cross if he's kept chained all the time, and it was the same thing with the man. He had not a thing to do all day but to lie and curse his fate. And the time came when he wanted to curse everything. This was never for very long, however, for when Ona began to cry, Jurgis could not stay angry. The poor fellow looked like a homeless ghost, and his cheeks sunken in, and his long black hair straggling into his eyes. He was too discouraged to cut it, to think about his appearance. His muscles were wasting away, and what were left were soft and flabby. He had no appetite, and they could not afford to tempt him with delicacies. It was better, he said, that he should not eat. Excuse me. It was the saving. About the end of March, he had got hold of Ona's bank book and learned that were only $3 left for them in the whole world. But perhaps the worst of the consequence of this long siege was that they lost another member of their family. Brother Jonas had disappeared. One Saturday night, he did not come home, and thereafter all their efforts to get trace of him were futile. It was said by the boss at Durham's that he had gotten a week's money and left there. That might not be true, of course, for sometimes they would say that when a man had been killed. It was the easiest way out of it for all concerned. When, for instance, a man had fallen into one of the rendering tanks and had made into pure leaf lard and peerless fertilizer, there was no use letting the fact out and making his family unhappy. More probable, however, was the theory that Jonas had deserted them and gone on the road seeking happiness. He had been discontented for a long time, and not without some good cause. He paid good board and was yet obliged to live in a family where nobody had enough to eat. And Marija would keep giving them all her money, and of course he could not but feel that he was called upon to do the same. Then there were the crying brats, all sorts of misery. A man could have had to be a good deal of a hero to stand it all without grumbling, and Jonas was not the least a hero. He was simply a weather-beaten old fellow who liked to have a good supper and sit in the corner by the fire and smoke his pipe in peace before he went to bed. Here there was not room by the fire, and through the winter the kitchen had seldom been warm enough for comfort. So with the springtime, what was more likely was that the wild idea of escaping had come to him. 2 years he had been yoked like a horse on a half-ton truck in Durham's dark cellars, with never a rest, save on Sundays and 4 holidays in the year, and with never a word of thanks, only kicks and blows and curses, such as no decent dog would have stood. And now the winter was over, and the spring winds were blowing, and with a day's walk, a man might put the smoke of Packingtown behind him forever and be where the grass was green and the flowers and all the colors of the rainbow. But now the income of the family was cut down by more than a third, and the food demand was cut only by 1/11th, so that they were the worse off than ever. Also, they were borrowing money from Marija and eating up her bank account and spoiling once again her hopes of marriage and happiness. And they were even going into debt with Tamos and letting him impoverish himself. Poor Tasmos was a man without any relatives and with a wonderful talent besides. He ought to have made money and prospered, but he had fallen in love and so given hostages to fortune and was doomed to be dragged down too. So it was finally decided that 2 more of the children would have to leave school. Next to Stanislaus, who was now 15, there was a girl, Katerina, who was 2 years younger than the 2 boys, Vilhelmus, and was 11, and Nikolai, who was 10. Both of these were bright boys, and there was no reason why their family should starve when tens of thousands of children no older than they were earning their own livings. So the morning they were given a quarter piece and a roll with sausage in it, and with their minds top heavy, with good advice, were sent out to make their way to the city and to learn to sell newspapers. They came back that night in tears, having walked for 5 or 6 miles to report that a man had offered to take them to a place where they sold newspapers, and had taken their money and gone into a store to get them, and never more been seen. So they both received a whipping, and the next morning they set out again. This time they found a newspaper place and procured their stock, after wandering about till nearly noontime, saying paper to everyone who they saw. They had all their stock taken away and received a thrashing besides from a big newsman upon whose territory they had trespassed. Fortunately, however, they had already sold some papers and came back with nearly much money as they had started with. After a week of mishaps such as these, the 2 little fellows began to learn the ways of the trade, the names of the different papers and how many of each to get, and what sort of people to offer them to, and where to go and where to stay away from. After this, leaving home at 4 o'clock in the morning and running about the streets, first with morning papers and then with evening, they might come home with 20 or 30 cents apiece, possibly as much as 40 cents. From this, they had to deduct their car fare, since the distance was so great, but after a while they made friends and learned still more, and then they would save their car fare. They would get onto a car where the conductor was not looking and hide in the crowd. 3 or 4 times he would not have to ask for fares, either not seeing them or thinking that they had already paid, Or if he did ask, he would hunt down through their pockets and then begin to cry, and either have their fares paid by some nice old lady, or have their or else try the trick again on a new car. All this was fair play, they felt. Whose fault was it that the hours when working men were going to their work and back, oh, excuse me, the cars were crowded and the conductors could not collect all the fares? And besides, the companies were thieves, people said. They had stolen their franchises with the help of the scoldrelly politicians. Now that the winter was by, and there was no more danger of snow, and no more coal to buy, and another room warm enough to put the children in when they cried, and enough money to get along from week to week, Jurgis was less terrible than he had been. A man can get used to anything in the course of time, and Jurgis had gotten used to lying about the house. Ona saw this and was very careful not to destroy his peace of mind by letting him know how very much pain she was suffering. It was now the time for the spring rains, and Ona had often to ride to work, in spite of the expense. She was getting paler every day, and sometimes, in spite of her good resolutions, it pained her that Jurgis did not notice it. She wondered if he cared for her as much as ever, and if all this misery was not wearing on to his love. She had to be away from him all the time and bear her own troubles while he was bearing his. Then, when she came home, she was so worn out, and whenever they talked, they only had their worries to talk of. Truly, it was hard, in such a life, to keep any sentiment alive. The woe of this would flame up in Ona sometimes. At night, she would suddenly clasp her big husband in her arms and break into passionate weeping, demanding to know if he really loved her. Poor Jurgis, who had in truth grown more matter-of-fact under the endless pressure, would not know what to make of these things, and could only try to recollect when he had last been cross. And so Ona would have to forgive him and sob herself to sleep. The latter part of April, Jurgis went to see the doctor and was given a bandage to lace about his ankle and was told that he can go back to work. It needed more than permission of the doctor, however, for when he showed up on the killing floor of Brown's, he was told by the foreman it had not been possible to keep his job for him. Jurgis knew that this meant simply that the foreman had found someone else to do the work as well and did not want to bother to make a change. He stood in the doorway looking mournfully on, seeing his friends and companions at work and feeling like an outcast. Then he went out and took his place with the mob of the unemployed. This time, however, Jurgis did not have the same fine confidence, nor the same reason for it, for he was no longer the finest-looking man, and the bosses no longer made for him. He was thin and haggard, and his clothes were seedy, and he looked miserable. There were hundreds who looked and felt just like him, and who had been wandering about Packingtown for months begging for work. This was a critical time in Jurgis's life, and if he had been a weaker man, he would have gone the way the rest did. Those out-of-work wretches would stand about packing houses every morning till the police drove them away. Then they would scatter among the saloons. Very few of them had the nerve to face the rebuffs that they would encounter by trying to get into buildings to interview with bosses. If they did not get a chance in the morning, there would be nothing to do but hang out in the saloons for the rest of the day and night. Jurgis was saved all from this, partly, to be sure, because it was pleasant weather, and there was no need to be indoors, but mainly because he carried with him always the pitiful little face of his wife. He must get work, he told himself, fighting the battle with despair every hour after hour. He must get work. He must have a place again and some money saved up before the next winter came. But there was no work for him. He sought out all the members of his union. Jurgis had stuck to the union through all of this and begged them to speak a word for him. He went to everyone he knew asking for a chance there or anywhere. He wandered all day through the buildings, and in a week or two, when he had been all over the yards and in every room to which he had access, and learned that there was no job anywhere, he persuaded himself that he might have been a change of places from where he had visited first. Began the round all over. till finally the watchmen and the spotters of the companies came to know him by sight and to order him out with threats. There was nothing more for him to do but to go to the crowd in the morning and keep in the front row and look eager. When he failed, go back home and play with little Cortrina and the baby. The particular bitterness of all this was that Jurgis saw so plainly the meaning of it. In the beginning, he had been fresh and strong. He had gotten a job the first day, and now he was secondhand, a damaged article, so to speak, and they did not want him. They had got the best of him, and they had worn him out with their speeding up and their carelessness. Now they had thrown him away. And Jurgis would make the acquaintance of others of these unemployed men and find that they all had the same experience. There were some, of course, who had wandered in from other places, who had been ground up in other mills. There were others who were out from their own fault, some, for instance, who had not been able to stand the awful grind without drink. The vast majority, however, were simply the worn-out parts of the great merciless packing machine. They had toiled there and kept up with the pace, some of them for 10 or 20 years, until finally the time had come when they could not keep up with it anymore. Some had been frankly told that they were too old, that a sprier man was needed. Others had given occasion by some act of carelessness or incompetence with most. However, the occasion had been the same, as with Jurgis. They had been overworked and underfed so long, and finally some disease had laid them on their backs, or they had cut themselves and had blood poisoning, or met with some other accident. When a man came back after that, he would get his place back only by the courtesy of the boss. To this, there was no exception, save when the accident was one for which the firm was liable. In that case, they would send a slippery lawyer to see him, first to try to get him to sign away his claims, but if he was too smart for that, to promise him that he should always be provided with work. This promise they would keep strictly to the letter for 2 years. 2 years was the statute of limitations, and after that the victim could not sue. What happened to a man after any of these things all depended upon the circumstances. If they were highly skilled workers, he would probably have enough saved up to tide him over. The best paid men, the splitters, made 50 cents an hour, and it would be $5 or $6 a day in the rush seasons, and 1 or 2 in the dullest. The men could live and save on that. But then there were only half dozen splitters in each place, and one of them that Jurgis knew had a family of 22 children. Holy moly. Well, apparently he's very good at splitting beef, and he's apparently got talents of another kind. All of these children were hoping to grow up to be splitters like their father. For an unskilled man who made $10 a week in a rush season and $5 in a dull, it all depended on his age and the number he had dependent upon him. An unmarried man could save if he did not drink, and if he was absolutely selfish, that is, if he paid no heed to the demands of his old parents, or of his little brothers and sisters, or of any relatives he might have, as well as the other members of his union and his chums, and the people who might be starving to death next door. So the way you really save money is if you're a single person that has no friends, has no family, has no parents, anybody that you have to help take care of. All right, my friends, we're moving along. We're cruising. That was chapter 12. Starting chapter 13. During this time, Jurgis was looking for work. Let me back up. During this time that Jurgis was looking for work, occurred the death of little Christopharos, one of the children of Teta. Both Christopharos and his brother, Josappas, were cripples, and later having lost one leg by having it run over, and Christopharos having congenital dislocation of the hip, which made it impossible for him to ever walk. He was the last of Teta's children, and perhaps he had been intended by nature to let her know that she had had enough. At any rate, he was wretchedly sick and undersized. He had rickets, and though he was over 3 years old, he was no bigger than an ordinary child of 1. All day long he would crawl around the floor in a filthy little dress, whining and fretting because the floor was full of drafts, and he was always catching a cold and snuffling. It is snuffling, not sniffling, and snuffling because his nose ran. This made him a nuisance and a source of endless trouble in the family, for his mother, with unnatural perversity, loved him best of all of her children, and made a perpetual fuss over him. She would let him do anything undisturbed, and would burst into tears when he was fretting, when his fretting drove Jurgis wild. And now he had died. Perhaps it was the smoked sausage he had eaten that morning, which had been made out of some of the tubercular pork which was condemned as unfit for export. At any rate, an hour after eating, the child had begun to cry with pain, and in another hour he was rolling on the floor in convulsions. Little Katrina, who was alone with him, ran out screaming for help, and after a while a doctor came, but not until Christophorus had howled his last howl. No one was really sorry about this except for Elizabeta, who was inconsolable. Jurgis announced that so far as he was concerned, the child would have been buried by the city, since they had no money for the funeral. And at this, the poor woman almost went out of her senses, wringing her hands and screaming with grief and despair. Her child was to be buried in a pauper's grave, and her stepdaughter to stand by and hear it without protesting. It was enough to make Ona's father rise up out of the grave to rebuke her. If it had come to this, they might as well have given up at once, and all be buried, all of them together. In the end, Marija said she would help with $10, and Jurgis, still being obstinate, Elizabeta went into tears and begged the money from the neighbors, so that little Christophorus had a mass and a hearse with white plumes on it, and a tiny plot in a graveyard with a wooden cross to mark the place. The poor mother was not the same for months after that. The mere sight of the floor where little Christophorus had crawled about would make her weep. He had never had a fair chance, the poor little fellow, she would say. He had been handicapped from his birth. If only she had heard about it in time, so that she might have had the great doctor to cure him of his lameness. Some time ago, Elizabetha was told a Chicago billionaire had paid a fortune to bring a great European surgeon over to cure his little daughter of the same disease from which Christophorus had suffered. And because the surgeon had to have bodies to demonstrate upon, he announced that he would treat children of the poor. A piece. Yep, the cat's yelling at me, sorry. And because the surgeon had to have bodies to demonstrate upon, he announced that he would treat children of the poor, a piece of magnanimity over which the papers became quite eloquent. Elizabeta, alas, did not read the papers, and no one had told her, but perhaps it was all as well, for just then they would not have had the car fare to spare to go every day to wait upon the surgeon, nor, for that matter, anybody with the time to take the child. All this while he was seeking for work, there was a dark shadow hanging over Jurgis, as if a savage beast were looking somehow in the pathway of his life, and he knew it, and yet could not help approaching the place. There are all stages of being out of work in packing town, and he faced in dread the prospect of reaching the lowest. There is a place that waits for the lowest man, the fertilizer plant. The men would talk about in an awe-stricken whispers. No more than 1 in 10 had ever really tried it. The other 9 had contented themselves with hearsay evidence and a peep through the door. There were some things that were worse than even starving to death. They would ask Jurgis if he had worked there yet, and if he had meant to. And Jurgis would debate the matter with himself. As poor as they were and making all the sacrifices that they were, would he dare to refuse any sort of work that was offered to him, be it as horrible as ever it could? Would he dare to go home and eat bread that had been earned by Ona, weak and complaining as she was, knowing that he had been given a chance and had not the nerve to take it? And yet he might argue the way with himself all day, and one glimpse into the fertilizer works would send him away shuddering. He was a man, and he would do his duty. He went and he made an application, but surely he was not also required to hope for success. The fertilizer works at Durham's lay away from the rest of the plant. Few visitors ever saw them, and few who would come out looking like Dante, of whom the peasants declared that he had been to hell. To this part of the yards came all the tankage and the waste products of all sorts. Here they dried out the bones, and in suffocating cellars, where the daylight never came, you might see men and women and children bending over whirling machines and sawing bits of bones into all sorts of shape, breathing their lungs full of the fine dust, and doomed to die, every one of them, within a certain definite time. Here they made the blood into albumin, and made other foul-smelling things into things still more foul-smelling. In the corridors and caverns where it was done, you might lose yourself, as in the great caves of Kentucky. In the dust and the steam, the electric lights would shine like far-off twinkling stars, red and blue, green and purple stars, according to the color of the mist and the brew from which it came. For the order of these ghastly charnel houses, there may be words in Lithuanian, but there are none in English. The person entering would have to summon his courage for a cold water plunge. He would go in like a man swimming underwater. He would put his handkerchief over his face, begin to cough and choke, and then, if he were still obstinate, he would find his head beginning to ring, and the veins in his forehead to throb, until finally he would be assailed by an overpowering blast of ammonia fumes, and would turn and run for his life and come out half dazed. On top of this, there were rooms where they dried the tankage, the mass of brown, stringy stuff that was left after the waste portions of the carcasses had the lard and tallow dried out of them. This dried material they would then grind into a fine powder, and after they had mixed it up well with a mysterious but inoffensive brown rock, which they brought in and ground up by the hundreds of carloads for the purpose, the substance was ready to be put into bags and then sent out to the world as any one of 100 different brands of standard bone phosphate. And then the farmer in Maine or California or Texas would buy this and say $25 a ton and plant it with his corn. For several days after the operation, the fields would have a strong odor, and the farmer in his wagon with the very horses that had hauled it would have it too. In Packingtown, the fertilizer is pure instead of being flavoring, and instead of a ton or so spread out on several acres under the open sky. There are hundreds of thousands of tons of it in one building, heaped here and there in haystack piles, covering the floor several inches deep and filling the air with a choking dust that becomes a blinding sandstorm when the wind stirs. It was to this building that Jurgis came daily, as if dragged by an unseen hand. The month of May was an exceptionally cool one, and his secret prayers were granted. By early June, there came a record-breaking hot spell, and after that, there were men wanted in the fertilizer mill. The boss of the grinding room had come to know Jurgis by this time and had marked him for a likely man. And so when he came to the door about 2:00 on this hot, breathless day, he felt a sudden spasm of pain shoot through him. The boss beckoned to him. In 10 minutes more, Jurgis had pulled off his coat and overshirt and set his teeth together and gone to work. Here was one more difficulty for him to meet and conquer. His labor took him about 1 minute to learn. Before him was one of the vats of the mill in which the fertilizer was being ground. Rushing forth in a great brown river, with a spray of the finest dust flung forth to the clouds, Jurgis was given a shovel, and along with a half-dozen others, it was his task to shovel this fertilizer into carts. The others that were there to work knew by the sound, and by the fact that he sometimes collided with them. Otherwise, they might as well have not been there, for in the blinding dust storm, a man could not see 6 feet in front of his face. When he had filled one cart, he had to grope around him to find another one. And if there was none on hand, he continued to grope until one arrived. In 5 minutes, he was, of course, a mass fertilizer. He was covered in mass fertilizer from head to feet. They gave him a sponge to tie over his mouth so that he could breathe, but the sponge did not prevent his eyes and his lips and eyelids from caking up and his ears from filling solid with the fertilizer. Ooh, He looked like a brown ghost at twilight. And from hair to shoes, he became the color of the building and everything in it. And for that matter, 100 yards outside of it. The building had been left open. And when the wind blew, Durham and Company lost a great deal of fertilizer. Working in their sleeve shirts and with the thermometer over 100, the phosphate soaked in through every pore of Jurgis's thin skin. And in 5 minutes, he had a headache. In 15, he was dazed. The blood was pounding in his brain like an engine throbbing. There was a frightful pain at the top of his skull. He could hardly control his hands. Still, with the memory of his 4-month siege behind him, he fought on. In a frenzy of determination, a half hour later, he began to vomit. He vomited until it seemed as if his inwards were torn into shreds. Until it seemed, a man could get used to the fertilizer mill, the boss said, if he would make up his mind to do it. But Jurgis now began to see that it was a question of making up his stomach. I'm going to finish this page. At the end of the day of horror, he could scarcely stand. He had to catch himself now and then and lean against a building to get his bearings. Most of the men, when they came out, made straight for the saloon. They seemed to place fertilizer and rattlesnake poison in one class. But Jurgis was still too ill to think of drinking. He could only make his way to the street and stagger onto a car. He had a sense of humor, and later on, when he became an old hand, he used to think of it fun to board a streetcar and see what happened. Now, however, he was too ill to notice it. How the people in the car began to gasp and sputter, to put their handkerchiefs to their noses and transfix him with furious glances. Jurgis only knew that a man in front of him immediately got up and gave him a seat, and that a half minute later the two people on either side of him got up, and that in a full minute the crowded car was nearly empty, those passengers who could not get room on the platform having gotten out and walked. All right. So we got through a whole chapter. We got a good couple pages through another one. So, my friends, we are cruising along in the jungle. And boy, if you don't know why they call it the jungle by now, well, I don't know what to tell you, because it is a jungle. And boy, I don't think I would want to do it. There are parts, my friends, of just about every single job that just stinks, except being a teacher. It's the good stuff that makes up for it. But man, think about these people. Think about what they went through. You guys think you have it bad in school. You got it bad at Mr. Martin's class or Mr. Borrega's class or Mr. Mazzaroni's class. Well, woof. I don't know. I think we've got it kind of easy these days. I think my worst job, probably my most physically demanding job, back in the day when I worked in theater. I had just gotten out of college, and when you work in a lot of theaters, operate one of two ways. They either operate during the year, like the school year, and then they kind of shut down for a while, or they operate as a summer theater. So I worked for Capitol Repertory Theater for a few seasons, and I worked for Park Playhouse even when I was in college. And that job was probably physically the most demanding job that I had ever had. We worked pretty much from the last week in May, like right after Memorial Day, we would start working, and we would work 9 to 9 Tuesday to Sunday. And that's because in the theater world, unions, right, which work to better our conditions, unions had negotiated with theaters that they remain closed on Mondays. And that is a banking day. So you might have a barber or maybe a beauty salon that is not open on Monday or maybe a day during the week, but they are open on Saturday. And that's so that they can have a day where they can do all those things that, go to the bank, do business at the bank. They can go to a lawyer's office, or they can do those things. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do. But anyways, we would work 9 to 9 Tuesday through Sunday for 5 weeks. And in that time, we would build incredibly huge sets, sets that cost like we were, building a house. We would use more lumber to build the sets. That would, it would take, we could, if we decided, we could probably build 2 houses each summer with the amount of lumber that we used. But then in the 6th week, we would build and get things ready during the day. And then we would run the show at night. So the last week, usually we were working 9 in the morning to midnight, maybe 1 o'clock at night. And that was really intense. And I made very little money doing it, but I was building a career. And it paid off. I worked in a lot of different theaters. I actually had a job offer to work for Saturday Night Live, building their sets. A guy that I had worked with offered me a job. He said, I worked with him in a summer stock theater, and he said, listen, I got a couple openings. If you want one, you can have it. And then I was offered a job working at Juilliard, and I actually went there, and I lived with a friend of mine in New York City for a week. And after a week, I went to my new boss and I said, sorry, man, can't do it. And I quit because I just could not stand New York City. But it wasn't long after that I started teaching theater, which I did for 12 years before I came to the hallowed halls of Mahonison. And I never regretted it. I had a great career in theater. But, a lot of times jobs and a lot of times first jobs and building your career, it takes time like that, right? It really does. It takes a lot of time and a lot of dedication. And it ain't easy, but it's not what our friends, our Lithuanian friends, had to put up with. Okay, my friends. So there, I think today maybe we've hit our peak, and maybe the news is starting to get a little better. It's starting to get a little bit more contentious, I guess. But things are. It looks like we're moving in that good way that we need to move. As always, if you have questions, comments, concerns, throw them up there. So today there was a little bit of an uptick in deaths. However, a little bit of an uptick in hospitalizations. However, we're still on that downward curve. And the governor said that, and the governor met with the president today. He went down to Washington, D.C. He asked me if I could go and help negotiate, but, I didn't feel it was my place, so I turned him down. But it seems as though where we're at right now is 64% of all the cases, COVID cases in New York State, are in New York City itself. 21% of all the cases are on Long Island. 8% of the cases are in Westchester and Rockland County. Now that leaves 7%. So the rest of the state, which is what, 50 something counties, that's only 7% of the cases. However, so that's good. That's where we live. That's good. However, there is an uptick in Erie County. So out west, like Rochester, Buffalo area, there is now a surge of cases. So one of the things that the governor went to talk to the president about is, he believes, the governor, we need to test everybody, right? We need to get everybody tested. We need to find these antibodies. We need to get a vaccine. But this costs a lot of money. So apparently the president has pledged that he is going to help New York with some money, with some tests, so that we can get everybody tested. So I don't know, my friends, at some point, I'm assuming somehow all of us are going to go and, give some blood, and, they're going to figure this all out. So one of the good signs, we had talked way back when about the USGS, I think, the USGS Comfort, which was that huge hospital ship that they sent to New York. The governor has now told the president, thank you, we're good. There were patients that were treated on the Comfort, but we don't need it anymore. Send it to a state, send it to a place where it's needed. So I think within the next few days, that Comfort will be leaving New York City. What else do we have here? So one of the other things, I guess we'll stay with President Trump. So today, President Trump, I guess, I don't know if he did sign it today or not, but they're working on an executive order that will, for 60 days, ban immigration to the United States. And this is the president has come under fire for different immigration issues. When he first came in, the rogue states, right? He wanted to ban people from traveling to and from different Islamic majority, or countries that a majority of the people that live there were Muslims. This is, so basically what he's just saying is, for 60 days, we're going to stop letting immigrants come in that have secured green cards. So it's not like it's not a wall thing. It's just more of another measure to keep people from, coming into the country that could be possibly carrying the coronavirus. So it's not about building a wall. I think that probably most of the people he's talking about are, just people that are coming from more than likely anywhere besides Mexico and the Caribbean, where I think he's really worried about people coming in. So a lot of states today had protests. We had talked about that last night, the last few nights. In Michigan, the Michigan militia. In Virginia, people had guns in Michigan, but a lot more in Kentucky, in Georgia, in Arizona. And in Georgia, the Georgia governor has said by the end of this week, he made an announcement today. He said by the end of the week, he's going to start reopening businesses. However, the businesses are going to open with some pretty serious restrictions. So, like they were showing people like reopening gyms, like All the workers in the gyms are going to need masks. Anybody that comes in the gyms are going to need masks. Anybody that uses the weight machines, a staff member is going to have to come and wipe down the weight machine after they use it. So, is it going to be viable for them to do this? I mean, I don't know, right? I don't know. But they're going to try to get things rolling at the end of the week in Georgia. And that might be the test case, right? Maybe we'll see. What else? I got a lot of stuff here. I want to kind of leave the local stuff for last. Oh my goodness. So the first study came out. I hope I don't mess up this word. Hydroxychloroquine. This is the stuff that they said, the federal government said that this was the stuff that could really help people. If you found out you had the coronavirus early, this was something that was really going to be able to help people. And there was a big thing because President Trump owned stock in a company that makes this stuff and blah, blah, blah. Well, now a study came out today, which basically said, yeah, there's no difference. This isn't making a difference. So they know that right now. They know that this, even though they thought it was helping people early off, it wasn't. So let's see here. So oil sales, my friends, are plummeting, right? We talked about the future sales, so what's like being projected, but oil prices are plummeting. And, I think around the world, they're really not 100% sure. These oil-producing countries, they make a lot of money off oil, and they want to keep the oil rolling. But right now, it ain't looking so good. So they're going to have to keep cutting production to keep the price up, right? What is this? I'm sorry, I can't read my handwriting here. So this college student, that's what it is. Ashley Lawrence, sorry. So a college student has created a screen or a mask. So they're now starting to produce this mask that has a open, not glass, but clear plastic around the person's mouth. Because one of the issues they were having is that if you were deaf and you could read lips and you went into the doctor's office and there was no one that could sign with you, well, what are you going to do, right? You have to write everything down or, I don't know, find some other way to communicate, text your nurse or whatever. I don't know. And so I thought that was really cool. College student Ashley Lawrence. And they're already starting to produce these. So very, very cool. Another really cool thing that I saw was that a Glens Falls doctor who was apparently a doctor who specialized in working with AIDS patients since the early 80s and is now retired. I guess is now spending his time. He lives up in Glens Falls, making hundreds of masks for people in the healthcare profession and just giving them to people all around. So I thought that was a really cool thing. He's doing that, making them every day and handing them out every day. So some more local stuff. There's I think it's called the Teresian House, which is in Albany. It's a big nursing home in Albany. It's actually not that far. If it's where I think it is, it's not that far from where my dad lives. They had 22 new coronavirus cases today. So this is where it really seems like the big worry is right now, is that once that coronavirus gets into a nursing home, it's ripping through it. And I know I was talking to Miss D today, and I think it was down in New Jersey where, um, they literally, so many people were dying. They were packing up, stacking up the body bags. This nursing home was just ripping through a nursing home. So across the country, that's where I think it's really starting to hit the worst right now, is in with the old people in the homes. And I think they said that there are 4 workers at the Teresian house that are now under quarantine as well. So 22 residents and 4 staff members are under observation. All right, so other things, and we're doing okay. Other things in regards to the economy. So today, the United States Senate, not the New York State Senate, the U.S. Senate, and oh boy, yikes! That's over by the airport, right, Sydney? I think that's over by the airport. So the U.S. Senate, and you guys are aware that your United States senators are Kirsten Gillibrand and Chuck Schumer. They are our U.S. senators that represent New York State. Your representative in the House of Representatives is Paul Tonko. Mine is Antonio Delgado. Well, the U.S. Senate today passed a $484 billion stimulus plan. So we've talked about this $2.2 trillion stimulus plan, got people money, got small businesses money. There was military spending in it. Money for big businesses as well. But out of this, so it's still got to go to the House of Representatives and be passed. And they're going to vote on that Thursday. The House is going to vote on it. They're going to get it. They're going to debate it. Then they're going to vote on it on Thursday. Then the president will sign it. And then $484 billion will go out to $310 billion will be set aside for the Paycheck Protection Plan. So we had already talked about that. That was one of the parts of the big stimulus plan, which ran out. It ran out very, very quickly. And I think out of that 2.2 trillion, I want to say right around the same amount of money was set aside for the PPP. But I'll have to look that up. 75 billion out of the 484 billion is going to go directly to hospitals. So one of the problems that hospitals are having right now is, and Sydney, one day you're going to be a nurse, is that one of the first things that was stopped was elective surgeries. So let's say that I don't know what's a good elective surgery. Let's say I don't know that there's any good elective surgery. Plastic surgery. There you go. So let's say you were going to have some plastic surgery, a little nip and a tuck, right? Nope, we're not going to do it. Let's say that, what is that? Carpal tunnel surgery. I had to have my cataracts removed from my eyes, right? Non-emergent surgery, elective surgery has been called off. So I saw one hospital in Buffalo has lost $30 million in revenue. One hospital. because they haven't been allowed to do any of these elective surgeries. So even though, like in the ER and ICU and some of these, wards and hospitals have been overrun, there are other hospitals or other parts of hospitals that they've just had to shut down. They've had to furlough their employees because they deal mostly with elective and non-emergent surgery. So that's what a lot of this money is going to go towards, is helping those hospitals. And that's one of the things that, President Trump and Governor Cuomo talked about today is New York State has been, you guys live in the state that has been hardest hit by all of this. And Governor Cuomo is saying, if we don't get some federal aid, we are looking at like an $8 billion shortfall in our revenue, the money that we pull in from taxes to help pay all of our bills. So, we talked about that last night, a 20% cut across the board, schools, hospitals, local governments, regional governments, 20% cut. So that's a big concern, right? That's a real big concern. We've got to fight to get some federal aid, and hopefully we can. The other thing, so small businesses. Let's talk about some more small businesses. So, I wanted to dig in and find a little bit more about this, but they didn't have the actual amount of businesses. But Channel 13 News went door to door in Bethlehem today, business to business. And I'm assuming, some of these small businesses are closed, or maybe the owner's there, but they're just not really open. And half of the businesses that they polled have said that they do not think they are going to be able to survive this. So, now the thing about the article, which I didn't like, is that they didn't give the amount of businesses that were polled. If 4 businesses were polled, okay, right? Well, all right, two businesses are going to close. Yeah, that sucks, but still, when you read polls in the newspaper, when you hear polls in the news, I think it's good form for those organizations that are conducting the polls to say, we polled 50 small businesses in Bethlehem. Well, all right, now we know. Heck, that's all 25. That's a lot of businesses. So they're saying that 50% of the businesses that they polled are saying, nope, we are not going to make it through it. So I'd like to know how many of those businesses have applied and received money, how many have been applied and haven't gotten any money. But now that some more money is going into this PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, hopefully that can help. Hopefully that can help. But one of the areas that is, and I know we have a lot of cause students at Mohan. One of the areas that they're saying it's going to take a real long time to rebound is just that, right? Beauty salons, barbershops, your nail your not nail parlors, nail salons, right? These kinds of places, even when they open, what's it going to look like? Are they going to say, hey, come on in and anybody can, crowd the place, stay open 12 hours a day so you can start to recruit? I mean, when this is all over, people are going to be rushing to barbers and beauty salons. But they're trying to say, hey, are we going to get to a point where, a cosmetologist could go to somebody's home? Is that going to be okay? And do cuts and stuff like that. When they do open, are customers going to have masks? Are the cosmetologist, barbers going to have masks? There was even one that was talking about, like, Are they going to have some kind of air filtration system? And there was something about, and I didn't really understand it too, but there was something about, and I've never had my hair dyed, but they said there was something about them not being able to use the types of dyes that they use in the beauty parlors. And I don't know what that is. I don't know why they wouldn't be able to use it. But there was a lady from Guilderland that was interviewed, and I don't know. Do you guys know why hair dye would make people more susceptible to COVID? I don't know. I really don't know. I know that, like, when women are pregnant, and that they're not supposed to get their hair dyed, they're not really supposed to use makeup and stuff like that, because it like put a strain on your liver or something like that if those things get into your bloodstream and stuff. I don't know. So maybe that's it. But so anyways, they just don't know when this sector of our economy is going to really start to rebound. But the governor said that he's got the best people, working on this, and that, when we come out of this, he says we're going to be stronger. So, our state relies a lot on tourism. Think about how many people across the world want to go to New York City. There's a lot of people throughout the Northeast that want to go up to the Adirondacks. Excuse me, they want to go to Lake Placid. They want to go camping all over New York State. They want to go skiing, right, up in the Adirondacks. So we're losing all of that money. They want to go to the Catskills. So we're losing all of that tax revenue right now. And one of the predictions that I have, my friends, is this right now, and I'm not advocating for it, but I'm going to make this prediction that, the government of New York State is going to use this economic downturn to convince New Yorkers to do something. And this one thing will help to bring money into New York State. Let's see who can guess it. Let's see who can be the first person to guess what I'm talking about. The government of New York State is going to make a change, and this change will help bring money into the state and solve some of our problems. Let's see who can guess what I'm talking about. I know you're out there, people. All right. Oh, we're a little after 10, but that's okay. We'll do a quick rundown. This day in history. So this day in history, in 1836, we talked this year in U.S. history about westward expansion. We talked about the expansion of Americans into Texas, right? And then Texas breaking away from Mexico and becoming its own country for a short period of time. And on this day at San Jacinto, I think, was truly the last major battle with General Sam Houston, who will become the first president of the country of Texas. On this day in 1895, nobody's guessing this, huh? On this day in 1895, the first movie projector was projected a movie to a crowd. On this day in 1918, you've probably heard of the Red Baron. He was one of the first ever famous fighter pilots in the world. He was a German baron, and he had racked up 80 confirmed kills before he was shot down on this day in 1918. On this day in 1956, Elvis Presley had his first number one hit with Heartbreak Hotel. On this day in 1962, the Space Needle opened. I've never been out to the West Coast. I would like to go to Seattle. I'll make sure that I bring my raincoat. But on this day in 1962, that really cool Space Needle building opened. On this day in 1967, GM made or manufactured, it built its 1 millionth car on this day in 1967. And last but certainly not least, on this day in 1989, the student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square began, where students will be gunned down by the Chinese military because of their protests and their pro-democracy movements. So, man, that was a big jumble of things, right? So the thing that I'm talking about here, guys, I don't want to keep you too late, but the thing that I'm talking about is that, this is, and I saw somebody speak about this years ago, the thing that a lot of people thought would eventually legalize marijuana in New York State and in other states is the economic argument, not the, hey, America's about freedom and blah, 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 blah. It's more about tax revenue. So certainly, if we legalize marijuana in New York State, we're not going to have billions of dollars in revenue, but it'll start adding up. And I wouldn't be surprised if the governor and the state assembly and state senate legalize it for recreational use to try to boost tax revenue. I remember when Colorado first legalized it, one of the things that made national news was that in the first month they had legalized marijuana, $28 million in taxes came in. So that's a lot of money, guys. That's a lot of money. And it wasn't even really opened, right? It wasn't even full on chugging along and rolling. So, who knows? Who knows? Probably if we look at a state like Massachusetts, they've had it legal, I think, for a couple of years. Vermont, I think it's legal in Vermont now. It just became legal in New Hampshire and Maine. In New Jersey, it's legal. So we can look at those states and see what they're doing in regards to tax revenue and be able to say, well, hey, if they're making millions and millions of dollars a month selling it, why not us? So I have a feeling that through all this, it's probably going to be the one thing that really helps push it through. So, all right, my friends. Well, there it is. Another good night of reading. We are chugging along here. The book is interesting as ever. And I don't think it'll ever be made into a movie. Maybe I'm wrong. But, it's not a thriller of a movie to go and see. But as always, I hope everybody's out there and everybody's doing well. I hope that you are safe and your families are safe. And, continue to run the marathon, get outside. I had a beautiful, nice long walk this morning before the rain came. I think it's going to rain tomorrow too. So make sure you get out there and get a good walk in. Just get outside, maybe even sit outside and read a book for a little bit. But continue to run that marathon. Stay out of trouble. I miss you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow night. Be good.